Moonlight. A short story by Guy de Maupassant. Madame Julie Roubert was expecting her elder sister, Madame Henriette Latour, who had just returned from a trip to Switzerland. The Latour household had left nearly 5 weeks before. Madame Henriette had allowed her husband to return alone to their estate in Calvados, where some business required his attention, and had come to spend a few days in Paris with her sister. Night came on. In the quiet parlour, Madame Roubert was reading in the twilight in an absent-minded way, raising her eyes whenever she heard a sound. At last she heard a ring at the door, and her sister appeared, wrapped in a travelling cloak, and without any formal greeting they clasped each other in an affectionate embrace, only desisting for a moment to give each other another hug. Then they talked about their health, about their respective families, and 1,000 other things, gossiping, jerking out hurried, broken sentences as they followed each other about, while Madame Henriette was removing her hat and veil. It was now quite dark. Madame Roubert rang for a lamp, and as soon as it was brought in, she scanned her sister's face, and was on the point of embracing her once more. But she held back, scared and astonished at the other's appearance. On her temples, Madame Latour had 2 large locks of white hair. All the rest of her hair was of a glossy raven-black hue, but there alone, at each side of her head, ran, as it were, 2 silvery streams which were immediately lost in the black mass surrounding them. She was, nevertheless, only 24 years old, and this change had come on suddenly since her departure for Switzerland. Without moving, Madame Roubert gazed at her in amazement, tears rising to her eyes as she thought that some mysterious and terrible calamity must have befallen her sister. She asked, "What is the matter with you, Henriette?" Smiling with a sad face, the smile of one who is heartsick, the other replied, "Why, nothing, I assure you. Were you noticing my white hair?" But Madame Roubert impetuously seized her by the shoulders and with a searching glance at her repeated, "What is the matter with you? Tell me what is the matter with you, and if you tell me a falsehood, I'll soon find it out." They remained face to face, and Madame Henriette, who looked as if she were about to faint, had 2 pearly tears in the corners of her drooping eyes. Her sister continued, "What has happened to you? What is the matter with you? Answer me." Then, in a subdued voice, the other murmured, I have a lover." And hiding her forehead on the shoulder of her younger sister, she sobbed. Then, when she had grown a little calmer, when the heaving of her breast had subsided, she commenced to unbosom herself, as if to cast forth this secret from herself, to empty this sorrow of hers into a sympathetic heart. Thereupon, holding each other's hands tightly clasped, the 2 women went over to a sofa in a dark corner of the room into which they sank, and the younger sister, passing her arm over the elder one's neck and drawing her close to her heart, listened. "Oh, I know that there was no excuse for me. I do not understand myself, and since that day I feel as if I were mad. Be careful, my child, about yourself. Be careful. If you only knew how weak we are, how quickly we yield and fall. It takes so little, so little, so little, a moment of tenderness, one of those sudden fits of melancholy which come over you, one of those longings to open your arms, to love, to cherish something, which we all have at certain moments. You know my husband, and you know how fond I am of him. But he is mature and sensible, and cannot even comprehend the tender vibrations of a woman's heart. He is always the same, always good, always smiling, always kind, always perfect. Oh, how I sometimes have wished that he would clasp me roughly in his arms, that he would embrace me with those slow, sweet kisses which make 2 beings intermingle, which are like mute confidences. How I have wished that he were foolish, even weak, so that he should have need of me, of my caresses, of my tears. This all seems very silly, but we women are made like that. How can we help it? And yet the thought of deceiving him never entered my mind. Now it has happened, without love, without reason, without anything, simply because the moon shone one night on the lake of Lucerne. During the month when we were traveling together, my husband, with his calm indifference, paralyzed my enthusiasm, extinguished my poetic ardor. When we were descending the mountain paths at sunrise, when as the four horses galloped along with the diligence, we saw in the transparent morning haze valleys, woods, streams, and villages, I clasped my hands with delight and said to him, "How beautiful it is, dear! Give me a kiss. Kiss me now." He only answered with a smile of chilling kindliness, "There is no reason why we should kiss each other, because you like the landscape." And his words froze me to the heart. It seems to me that when people love each other, they ought to feel more moved by love than ever in the presence of beautiful scenes. In fact, I was brimming over with poetry, which he kept me from expressing. I was almost like a boiler filled with steam and hermetically sealed. One evening, we had for 4 days been staying in a hotel at Fleulen. Robert, having one of his sick headaches, went to bed immediately after dinner, and I went to take a walk all alone along the edge of the lake. It was a night such as one reads of in fairy tales. The full moon showed itself in the middle of the sky. The tall mountains, with their snowy crests, seemed to wear silver crowns. The waters of the lake glittered with tiny, shining ripples. The air was mild, with that kind of penetrating warmth which enervates us till we are ready to faint, to be deeply affected without any apparent cause. But how sensitive, how vibrating the heart is at such moments, how quickly it beats, and how intense is its emotion. I sat down on the grass and gazed at that vast, melancholy, and fascinating lake, and a strange feeling arose in me. I was seized with an insatiable need of love, a revolt against the gloomy dullness of my life. What? Would it never be my fate to wander, arm in arm, with a man I loved, along a moon-kissed bank like this? Was I never to feel on my lips those kisses so deep, delicious, and intoxicating, which lovers exchange on nights that seem to have been made by God for tenderness? Was I never to know ardent, feverish love in the moonlit shadows of a summer's night? And I burst out weeping like a crazy woman. I heard something stirring behind me. A man stood there, gazing at me. When I turned my head round, he recognized me, and advancing said, "You are weeping, madame?" It was a young barrister who was travelling with his mother, and whom we had often met. His eyes had frequently followed me. I was so confused that I did not know what answer to give or what to think of the situation. I told him I felt ill. He walked on by my side in a natural and respectful manner and began talking to me about what we had seen during our trip. All that I had felt he translated into words. Everything that made me thrill he understood perfectly, better than I did myself. And all of a sudden he repeated some verses of Alfred de Musset. I felt myself choking, seized with indescribable emotion. It seemed to me that the mountains themselves, the lake, the moonlight, were singing to me about things ineffably sweet. And it happened. I don't know how, I don't know why, in a sort of hallucination. As for him, I did not see him again till the morning of his departure. He gave me his card, and sinking into her sister's arms, Madame Latour broke into groans, almost into shrieks. Then Madame Roubert, with a self-contained and serious air, said very gently, "You see, sister, very often it is not a man that we love, but love itself. And your real lover that night was the moonlight." The False Gems, a short story by Guy de Maupassant. Monsieur Lantin had met the young girl at a reception at the house of the second head of his department and had fallen head over heels in love with her. She was the daughter of a provincial tax collector who had been dead several years. She and her mother came to live in Paris, where the latter, who made the acquaintance of some of the families in her neighborhood, hoped to find a husband for her daughter. They had very moderate means and were honourable, gentle, and quiet. The young girl was a perfect type of the virtuous woman in whose hands every sensible young man dreams of one day entrusting his happiness. Her simple beauty had the charm of angelic modesty, and the imperceptible smile which constantly hovered about the lips seemed to be the reflection of a pure and lovely soul. Her praises resounded on every side. People never tired of repeating, "Happy the man who wins her love." He could not find a better wife. Monsieur Lantin, then chief clerk in the Department of the Interior, enjoyed a snug little salary of 3,500 francs, and he proposed to this model young girl and was accepted. He was unspeakably happy with her. She governed his household with such clever economy that they seemed to live in luxury. She lavished the most delicate attentions on her husband, coaxed and fondled him, and so great was her charm that 6 years after their marriage, Monsieur Lantin discovered that he loved his wife even more than during the first days of their honeymoon. He found fault with only two of her tastes, her love for the theatre and her taste for imitation jewellery. Her friends, the wives of some petty officials, frequently procured for her a box at the theatre, often for the first representations of the new plays, and her husband was obliged to accompany her, whether he wished it or not, to these entertainments which bored him excessively after his day's work at the office. After a time, Monsieur Lantin begged his wife to request some lady of her acquaintance to accompany her and to bring her home after the theatre. She opposed this arrangement at first, but after much persuasion finally consented, to the infinite delight of her husband. Now, with her love for the theatre, came also the desire for ornaments. Her costumes remained as before, simple, in good taste, and always modest, but she soon began to adorn her ears with huge rhinestones, which glittered and sparkled like real diamonds. Around her neck she wore strings of false pearls, on her arms bracelets of imitation gold, and combs set with glass jewels. Her husband frequently remonstrated with her, saying, "My dear, as you cannot afford to buy real jewellery, you ought to appear adorned with your beauty and modesty alone, which are the rarest ornaments of your sex." But she would smile sweetly and say, "What can I do? I am so fond of jewellery. It is my only weakness. We cannot change our nature." Then she would wind the pearl necklace round her fingers, make the facets of the crystal gems sparkle, and say, "Look, are they not lovely? One would swear they were real." Monsieur Lantin would then answer smilingly, "You have bohemian tastes, my dear." Sometimes, of an evening, when they were enjoying a tête-à-tête by the fireside, she would place on the tea-table the Morocco leather box containing the trash, as Monsieur Lantin called it. She would examine the false gems with a passionate attention, as though they imparted some deep and secret joy, and she often persisted in passing a necklace around her husband's neck, and laughing heartily would exclaim, "How droll you look!" Then she would throw herself into his arms and kiss him affectionately. One evening, in winter, she had been to the opera, and returned home chilled through and through. The next morning she coughed, and 8 days later she died of inflammation of the lungs. Monsieur Lantin's despair was so great that his hair became white in 1 month. He wept unceasingly. His heart was broken as he remembered her smile, her voice, every charm of his dead wife. Time did not assuage his grief. Often, during office hours, while his colleagues were discussing the topics of the day, his eyes would suddenly fill with tears, and he would give vent to his grief in heart-rending sobs. Everything in his wife's room remained as it was during her lifetime, all her furniture, even her clothing, being left as it was on the day of her death. Here he was wont to seclude himself daily and think of her who had been his treasure, the joy of his existence. But life soon became a struggle. His income, which in the hands of his wife covered all household expenses, was now no longer sufficient for his own immediate wants, and he wondered how she could have managed to buy such excellent wine and the rare delicacies which he could no longer procure with his modest resources. He incurred some debts and was soon reduced to absolute poverty. One morning, finding himself without a cent in his pocket, he resolved to sell something, and immediately the thought occurred to him of disposing of his wife's paste jewels, for he cherished in his heart a sort of rancour against these deceptions, which had always irritated him in the past. The very sight of them spoiled, somewhat, the memory of his lost darling. To the last days of her life, she had continued to make purchases, bringing home new gems almost every evening, and he turned them over some time before finally deciding to sell the heavy necklace, which she seemed to prefer, and which, he thought, ought to be worth about 6 or 7 francs, for it was a very fine workmanship, though only imitation. He put it in his pocket and started out in search of what seemed a reliable jeweller's shop. At length he found one and went in, feeling a little ashamed to expose his misery, and also to offer such a worthless article for sale. "Sir," said he to the merchant, "I would like to know what this is worth." The man took the necklace, examined it, called his clerk, and made some remarks in an undertone. He then put the ornament back on the counter and looked at it from a distance to judge of the effect. Monsieur Lantin, annoyed at all these ceremonies, was on the point of saying, "Oh, I know well enough it is not worth anything," when the jeweller said, "Sir, that necklace is worth from 12 to 15,000 francs, but I couldn't buy it unless you can tell me exactly where it came from." The widower opened his eyes wide and remained gaping, not comprehending the merchant's meaning. Finally he stammered, "You say, are you sure?" The other replied dryly, "You can try elsewhere and see if anyone will offer you more. I consider it worth 15,000 at the most. Come back, here, if you cannot do better." Monsieur Lantin, beside himself with astonishment, took up the necklace and left the store. He wished time for reflection. Once outside, he felt inclined to laugh and said to himself, "The fool! Oh, the fool! Had I only taken him at his word, that jeweller cannot distinguish real diamonds from the imitation article." A few minutes after, he entered another store in the Rue de la Paix. As soon as the proprietor glanced at the necklace, he cried out, "Ah, parbleu! I know it well. It was bought here." Monsieur Lantin, greatly disturbed, asked, "How much is it worth?" "Well, I sold it for 20,000 francs. I am willing to take it back for 18,000 when you inform me, according to our legal formality, how it came to be in your possession." This time, Monsieur Lantin was dumbfounded. He replied, But, examine it well. Until this moment, I was under the impression that it was imitation." The jeweller asked, "What is your name, sir?" "Lantin. I am in the employ of the Minister of the Interior. I live at number 16 Rue des Martyrs." The merchant looked through his books, found the entry, and said, "That necklace was sent to Madame Lantin's address, 16 Rue des Martyrs, July 20th, 1876. The two men looked into each other's eyes, the widower speechless with astonishment, the jeweller scenting a thief. The latter broke the silence. "Will you leave this necklace here for 24 hours?" said he. "I will give you a receipt." Monsieur Lantin answered hastily, "Yes, certainly." Then, putting the ticket in his pocket, he left the store. He wandered aimlessly through the streets, his mind in a state of dreadful confusion. He tried to reason, to understand. His wife could not afford to purchase such a costly ornament, certainly not. But then it must have been a present. A present. A present. From whom? Why was it given her? He stopped and remained standing in the middle of the street. A horrible doubt entered his mind. She? Then all the other jewels must have been presents too. The earth seemed to tremble beneath him, the tree before him to be falling. He threw up his arms and fell to the ground, unconscious. He recovered his senses in a pharmacy into which the passers-by had borne him. He asked to be taken home, and when he reached the house, he shut himself up in his room and wept until nightfall. Finally, overcome with fatigue, he went to bed and fell into a heavy sleep. The sun awoke him next morning, and he began to dress slowly to go to the office. It was hard to work after such shocks. He sent a letter to his employer requesting to be excused. Then he remembered that he had to return to the jeweller's. He did not like the idea, but he could not leave the necklace with that man. He dressed and went out. It was a lovely day. A clear blue sky smiled on the busy city below. Men of leisure were strolling about with their hands in their pockets. Monsieur Lantin, observing them, said to himself, "The rich, indeed, are happy. With money, it is possible to forget even the deepest sorrow. One can go where one pleases, and in travel find that distraction which is the surest cure for grief. Oh, if I were only rich." He perceived that he was hungry, but his pocket was empty. He again remembered the necklace. 18,000 francs. 18,000 francs. What a sum! He soon arrived in the Rue de la Paix, opposite the jeweller's. 18,000 francs. 20 times he resolved to go in, but shame kept him back. He was hungry, however, very hungry, and not a cent in his pocket. He decided quickly, ran across the street in order not to have time for reflection, and rushed into the store. The proprietor immediately came forward and politely offered him a chair. The clerks glanced at him knowingly. "I have made inquiries, Monsieur Lantin," said the jeweller, "and if you are still resolved to dispose of the gems, I am ready to pay you the price I offered." "Certainly, sir," stammered Monsieur Lantin. Whereupon the proprietor took from a drawer 18 large bills, counted, and handed them to Monsieur Lantin, who signed a receipt, and with trembling hand put the money into his pocket. As he was about to leave the store, he turned toward the merchant, who still wore the same knowing smile, and lowering his eyes, said, I have other gems, which came from the same source. Will you buy them also?" The merchant bowed. "Certainly, sir." Monsieur Lantin said gravely, "I will bring them to you." An hour later, he returned with the gems. The large diamond earrings were worth 20,000 francs, the bracelets, 35,000, the rings, 16,000, a set of emeralds and sapphires, 14,000, a gold chain with solitaire pendant, 40,000, making the sum of 143,000 francs. The jeweller remarked, jokingly, there was a person who invested all her savings in precious stones. Monsieur Lantin replied, seriously, "It is only another way of investing one's money." That day he lunched at Voisin's and drank wine worth 20 francs a bottle. Then he hired a carriage and made a tour of the Bois. He gazed at the various turnouts with a kind of disdain and could hardly refrain from crying out to the occupants, "I too am rich. I am worth 200,000 francs. Suddenly he thought of his employer. He drove up to the bureau and entered gaily, saying, "Sir, I have come to resign my position. I have just inherited 300,000 francs. He shook hands with his former colleagues and confided to them some of his projects for the future. He then went off to dine at the Café Anglais. He seated himself beside a gentleman of aristocratic bearing, and during the meal informed the latter confidentially that he had just inherited a fortune of 400,000 francs. For the first time in his life, he was not bored at the theatre, and spent the remainder of the night in a gay frolic. 6 months afterward, he married again. His second wife was a very virtuous woman, but had a violent temper. She caused him much sorrow. The Diamond Necklace, a short story by Guy de Maupassant. The girl was one of those pretty and charming young creatures who sometimes are born, as if by a slip of fate, into a family of clerks. She had no dowry, no expectations, no way of being known, understood, loved, married by any rich and distinguished man. So she let herself be married to a little clerk of the Ministry of Public Instruction. She dressed plainly because she could not dress well, but she was unhappy as if she had really fallen from a higher station. Since with women there is neither caste nor rank, for beauty, grace and charm take the place of family and birth. Natural ingenuity, instinct for what is elegant, a supple mind are their sole hierarchy, and often make of women of the people the equals of the very greatest ladies. Matilda suffered ceaselessly, feeling herself born to enjoy all delicacies and all luxuries. She was distressed at the poverty of her dwelling, at the bareness of the walls, at the shabby chairs, the ugliness of the curtains. All those things, of which another woman of her rank would never even have been conscious, tortured her and made her angry. The sight of the little Breton peasant who did her humble housework aroused in her despairing regrets and bewildering dreams. She thought of silent antechambers hung with oriental tapestry, illumined by tall bronze candelabra, and of two great footmen in knee-breeches who sleep in the big armchairs, made drowsy by the oppressive heat of the stove. She thought of long reception halls hung with ancient silk, of the dainty cabinets containing priceless curiosities, and of the little coquettish, perfumed reception rooms made for chatting at 5 o'clock with intimate friends, with men famous and sought after, whom all women envy and whose attention they all desire. When she sat down to dinner, before the round table covered with a tablecloth in use 3 days, opposite her husband, who uncovered the soup tureen and declared with a delighted air,
"Ah, the good soup. I don't know anything better than that."
She thought of dainty dinners, of shining silverware, of tapestry that peopled the walls with ancient personages and with strange birds flying in the midst of a fairy forest, and she thought of delicious dishes served on marvellous plates, and of the whispered gallantries to which you listen with a sphinx-like smile while you are eating the pink meat of a trout or the wings of a quail. She had no gowns, no jewels, nothing, and she loved nothing but that. She felt made for that. She would have liked so much to please, to be envied, to be charming, to be sought after. She had a friend, a former schoolmate at the convent, who was rich, and whom she did not like to go to see any more because she felt so sad when she came home. But one evening her husband reached home with a triumphant air and holding a large envelope in his hand.
"There,"
said he.
"there is something for you."
She tore the paper quickly and drew out a printed card which bore these words: "The Minister of Public Instruction and Madame Georges Ramponneau request the honour of Monsieur and Madame Loisel's company at the Palace of the Ministry on Monday evening, January 18th. Instead of being delighted, as her husband had hoped, she threw the invitation on the table crossly, muttering,
"What do you wish me to do with that?"
"Why, my dear, I thought you would be glad. You never go out, and this is such a fine opportunity. I had great trouble to get it. Everyone wants to go. It is very select, and they are not giving many invitations to clerks. The whole official world will be there."
She looked at him with an irritated glance and said impatiently,
"And what do you wish me to put on my back?"
He had not thought of that. He stammered,
"Why, the gown you go to the theatre in. It looks very well to me."
He stopped, distracted, seeing that his wife was weeping. 2 great tears ran slowly from the corners of her eyes toward the corners of her mouth.
"What's the matter? What's the matter?"
he answered. By a violent effort she conquered her grief and replied in a calm voice, while she wiped her wet cheeks.
"Nothing. Only I have no gown and therefore I can't go to this ball. Give your card to some colleague whose wife is better equipped than I am."
He was in despair. He resumed,
"Come, let us see, Mathilde. How much would it cost? A suitable gown, which you could use on other occasions. Something very simple."
She reflected several seconds, making her calculations and wondering also what sum she could ask without drawing on herself an immediate refusal and a frightened exclamation from the economical clerk. Finally she replied, hesitating,
"I don't know exactly, but I think I could manage it with 400 francs.
He grew a little pale, because he was laying aside just that amount to buy a gun and treat himself to a little shooting next summer on the plain of Nanterre, with several friends who went to shoot larks there of a Sunday. But he said,
"Very well, I will give you 400 francs, and try to have a pretty gown."
The day of the ball drew near, and Madame Loisel seemed sad, uneasy, anxious. Her frock was ready, however. Her husband said to her one evening,
"What is the matter? Come, you have seemed very queer these last 3 days."
and she answered,
It annoys me not to have a single piece of jewellery, not a single ornament, nothing to put on. I shall look poverty-stricken. I would almost rather not go at all.
"You might wear natural flowers,"
said her husband.
"They're very stylish at this time of year. For 10 francs, you can get 2 or 3 magnificent roses."
She was not convinced.
No, there's nothing more humiliating than to look poor among other women who are rich.
"How stupid you are!"
Her husband cried.
"Go look up your friend Madame Forestier and ask her to lend you some jewels. You're intimate enough with her to do that."
She uttered a cry of joy.
True, I never thought of it.
The next day she went to her friend and told her of her distress. Madame Forestier went to a wardrobe with a mirror, took out a large jewel box, brought it back, opened it, and said to Madame Loisel,
"Choose, my dear."
She saw first some bracelets, then a pearl necklace, then a Venetian gold cross set with precious stones of admirable workmanship. She tried on the ornaments before the mirror, hesitated, and could not make up her mind to part with them, to give them back. She kept asking,
Haven't you any more?
"Why, yes. Look further. I don't know what you like."
Suddenly she discovered in a black satin box a superb diamond necklace, and her heart throbbed with an immoderate desire. Her hands trembled as she took it. She fastened it round her throat, outside her high-necked waist, and was lost in ecstasy at her reflection in the mirror. Then she asked, hesitating, filled with anxious doubt,
Will you lend me this? Only this?
"Why, yes, certainly."
She threw her arms round her friend's neck, kissed her passionately, then fled with her treasure. The night of the ball arrived. Madame Loisel was a great success. She was prettier than any other woman present, elegant, graceful, smiling and wild with joy. All the men looked at her, asked her name, sought to be introduced. All the attachés of the cabinet wished to waltz with her. She was remarked by the minister himself. She danced with rapture, with passion, intoxicated by pleasure, forgetting all in the triumph of her beauty, in the glory of her success, in a sort of cloud of happiness comprised of all this homage, admiration, these awakened desires, and of that sense of triumph which is so sweet to woman's heart. She left the ball about 4 o'clock in the morning. Her husband had been sleeping since midnight in a little deserted anteroom with 3 other gentlemen whose wives were enjoying the ball. He threw over her shoulders the wraps he had brought, the modest wraps of common life, the poverty of which contrasted with the elegance of the ball dress. She felt this, and wished to escape so as not to be remarked by the other women, who were enveloping themselves in costly furs. Loisel held her back, saying,
"Wait a bit. You will catch cold outside. I will call a cab."
But she did not listen to him, and rapidly descended the stairs. When they reached the street, they could not find a carriage and began to look for one, shouting after the cabmen passing at a distance. They went toward the Seine in despair, shivering with cold. At last, they found on the quay one of those ancient nightcabs which, as though they were ashamed to show their shabbiness during the day, are never seen round Paris until after dark. It took them to their dwelling in the Rue des Martyrs, and sadly they mounted the stairs to their flat. All was ended for her. As to him, he reflected that he must be at the ministry at 10 o'clock that morning. She removed her wraps before the glass so as to see herself once more in all her glory. But suddenly she uttered a cry. She no longer had the necklace around her neck. "What is the matter with you?" demanded her husband, already half undressed. She turned distractedly toward him.
I've lost Madame Forestier's necklace.
She cried. He stood up, bewildered. "What? How? Impossible!" They looked among the folds of her skirt, of her cloak, in her pockets, everywhere, but did not find it.
"You're sure you had it on when you left the ball?"
He asked.
Yes, I felt it in the vestibule of the minister's house.
"But if you had lost it in the street, we should have heard it fall. It must be in the cab."
Yes, Probably. Did you take his number?
No, and you, didn't you notice it?
No.
They looked, thunderstruck at each other. At last, Loisel put on his clothes.
I shall go back on foot,
Said he.
over the whole route to see whether I can find it.
He went out. She sat waiting on a chair in her ball dress, without strength to go to bed, overwhelmed, without any fire, without a thought. Her husband returned about 7 o'clock. He had found nothing. He went to police headquarters, to the newspaper offices to offer a reward. He went to the cab companies, everywhere in fact, whither he was urged by the least spark of hope. She waited all day, in the same condition of mad fear before this terrible calamity. Loisel returned at night with a hollow, pale face. He had discovered nothing.
You must write to your friend,
Said he.
that you have broken the clasp of her necklace and that you are having it mended. That will give us time to turn round.
She wrote at his dictation. At the end of a week, they had lost all hope. Loisel, who had aged 5 years, declared,
We must consider how to replace that ornament.
The next day they took the box that had contained it and went to the jeweller whose name was found within. He consulted his books.
It was not I, madame, who sold that necklace. I must simply have furnished the case.
Then they went from jeweller to jeweller, searching for a necklace like the other, trying to recall it, both sick with chagrin and grief. They found, in a shop at the Palais Royal, a string of diamonds that seemed to them exactly like the one they had lost. It was worth 40,000 francs. They could have it for 36. So they begged the jeweller not to sell it for 3 days yet, and they made a bargain that he should buy it back for 34,000 francs in case they should find the lost necklace before the end of February. Loisel possessed 18,000 francs which his father had left him. He would borrow the rest. He did borrow, asking 1,000 francs of one, 500 of another, 5 louis here, 3 louis there. He gave notes, took up ruinous obligations, dealt with usurers and all the race of lenders. He compromised all the rest of his life, risked signing a note without even knowing whether he could meet it, and frightened by the trouble yet to come, by the black misery that was about to fall upon him, by the prospect of all the physical privations and moral tortures that he was to suffer, he went to get the new necklace, laying upon the jeweller's counter 36,000 francs. When Madame Loisel took back the necklace, Madame Forestier said to her with a chilly manner,
You should have returned it sooner. I might have needed it.
She did not open the case, as her friend had so much feared. If she had detected the substitution, what would she have thought? What would she have said? Would she not have taken Madame Loisel for a thief? Thereafter, Madame Loisel knew the horrible existence of the needy. She bore her part, however, with sudden heroism. That dreadful debt must be paid. She would pay it. They dismissed their servant. They changed their lodgings. They rented a garret under the roof. She came to know what heavy housework meant and the odious cares of the kitchen. She washed the dishes, using her dainty fingers and rosy nails on greasy pots and pans. She washed the soiled linen, the shirts and the dishcloths, which she dried upon a line. She carried the slops down to the street every morning and carried up the water, stopping for breath at every landing. And dressed like a woman of the people, she went to the fruiterer, the grocer, the butcher, a basket on her arm, bargaining, meeting with impertinence, defending her miserable money, sou by sou. Every month they had to meet some notes, renew others, obtain more time. Her husband worked evenings, making up a tradesman's accounts, and late at night he often copied manuscript for 5 sous a page. This life lasted 10 years. At the end of 10 years they had paid everything, with the rates of usury and the accumulations of the compound interest. Madame Loisel looked old now. She had become the woman of impoverished households, strong and hard and rough. With frowsy hair, skirts askew and red hands, she talked loud while washing the floor with great swishes of water. But sometimes, when her husband was at the office, she sat down near the window, and she thought of that gay evening of long ago, of that ball where she had been so beautiful and so admired. What would have happened if she had not lost that necklace? Who knows? Who knows? How strange and changeful is life! How small a thing is needed to make or ruin us! But one Sunday, having gone to take a walk in the Champs-Élysées to refresh herself after the labours of the week, she suddenly perceived a woman who was leading a child. It was Madame Forestier, still young, still beautiful, still charming. Madame Loisel felt moved. Should she speak to her? Yes, certainly. And now that she had paid, she would tell her all about it. Why not? She went up.
Good day, Jean.
The other, astonished to be familiarly addressed by this plain good wife, did not recognize her at all and stammered,
But, Madame, I do not know. You must have mistaken.
No, I am Mathilde Loisel.
Her friend uttered a cry.
Oh, my poor Mathilde, how you are changed.
Yes, I have had a pretty hard life since I last saw you, and great poverty, and that because of you.
Of me? How so?
Do you remember that diamond necklace you lent me to wear at the ministerial ball?
Yes, very well.
Well, I lost it.
What do you mean you brought it back?
I brought you back another exactly like it, and it has taken us 10 years to pay for it. You can understand that it was not easy for us who had nothing. At last it is ended, and I am very glad.
Madame Forestier had stopped.
You say that you bought a necklace of diamonds to replace mine.
Yes, you never noticed it then. They were very similar.
And she smiled with a joy that was at once proud and ingenuous. Madame Forestier, deeply moved, took her hands.
Oh, my poor Mathilde! Why, my necklace was paste. It was worth at most only 500 francs.